Okay, well, welcome everyone to our September at Home. We've got 4 speakers today, and I'd like to introduce the first of our speakers, who is Emily Wells. Emily is a doctoral student at William and Mary College in Virginia, and she's interned at a number of museums in the US, including Historic Deerfield and Colonial Williamsburg. Her doctoral thesis examines the relationship between place and identity among elite white girls who lived in the American South during the early national and antebellum periods. Emily's paper this afternoon will draw on her doctoral research. Emily, I'd like to pass over to you, and if you'd like to share your screen, please.
Thank you. Just give me one moment. All right. So thank you for that introduction, Lynn. My name is Emily. I am a doctoral student in Virginia at William and Mary. My dissertation is titled Keep Within Compass, Geographies of Girlhood in the American South, 1783 to 1865. And I'm looking at how elite white girls negotiated and performed their social identities through interactions with place. And sometimes these places were physical structures or landscapes that they inhabited, like their homes or their schools. But sometimes there are places that they had only read about in newspapers or books. So for the purposes of my dissertation, I define the South as any state or territory in which slavery was legal. So this means all the states that eventually joined the Confederacy, which are highlighted here in red, as well as the slave states that did not secede from the Union, which are highlighted in light blue. And I spent the last few years traveling all over the South, looking for documents written by and about girls. And I mostly look for papers that provide insight into girls' subjective experiences, like letters, diaries, memoirs. But I also use documents like school records and financial accounts to help reconstruct the worlds that they inhabited. And as you might expect, clothing and textiles come up quite a bit in these documents. Girls talk about the latest fashions, they exchange needlework patterns, and they employ each other as proxy shoppers. I also come across a lot of letters by men to girls relaying the latest fashions or using dress as a proxy to discuss more sensitive topics. And although clothing and textiles aren't the main focus of my research, they play an important role as tools that girls used to mediate their interactions with physical space and signal their own social belonging. So today I'm going to just highlight a few interesting documents that I've come across. And before we dive in, I just want to say there's going to be a lot of grammar and spelling errors in the quotations that I use, and that's because I've copied them directly from the source, so apologies in advance. So the first documents that I usually look for when I want references to girls and textiles are those that relate to their experiences in formal educational settings. And I think this is because we have such a rich material archive of samplers and other textile objects produced by girls when they were students. So as many of you know, female academies and seminaries were responsible for educating girls in needlework as well as academic subjects. And this was particularly true early in the 19th century. If we look, for example, at 2 bills pertaining to the education of Anne Nesfield Steele, a teenage girl in North Carolina who attended the Bethlehem Female Seminary in Philadelphia from 1799 to 1800, we can observe just how much attention was placed on needlework education. So here I've pulled out all of the items on these 2 bills that relate in some way to clothing and textiles, as well as other female accomplishments. So in addition to various textiles like linen, silk, and ribbon, we also see specific references to the type of work that Anne was doing, such as working a shawl for her aunt and making up glass pocketbooks and pincushions. And in some instances, it's difficult to tell which items refer to pieces that Anne was doing herself in which she outsourced to others. So, for example, the line that says drawing a screen could refer to the labor of one of Anne's instructors, or it could refer to the materials that Anne needed to draw what I assume is the pattern for an embroidered screen. And although none of Anne's needlework survives, it is likely that she embroidered at least one sampler or needlework picture that was later framed and displayed in her family's home. In November 1799, just 1 month after the last bill from the Bethlehem Female Seminary, Anne's father paid a Philadelphia craftsman who advertised himself as a carver and gilder to create a gilt frame for a piece of needlework. But even beyond formal school exercises, textiles played an important role in female education. If we jump forward a few years, we encounter Antoinette Prevost, a schoolgirl in Philadelphia, writing to her friend Victorine Dupont, who had recently returned to her family's home in Delaware. When she wrote, Antoinette was in a state of alarm. "Dismal tidings, dear Victorine. All the young ladies of the first class must work themselves a frock to wear at the examination after Christmas. I will try to begin mine next week, but alas, will it ever get done?" Examinations were important public events attended by parents and local families, so Antoinette's concern here is understandable. A little over a week later, Antoinette wrote again, sharing the pattern that she had chosen for her examination dress, and asking her friend, who she hoped would return to attend the examination, to work a dress in the same pattern. "Cousin and myself have determined to be alike," she wrote. "Do take this also, for it would be a pity if the three graces did not resemble each other." Documents like letters and receipts can also provide a lot of information about what girls were actually wearing or what they might have aspired to wear in their everyday lives. For example, this receipt that shows that Miss Steele, who is probably the same Anne Steele who we discussed previously, purchased a number of clothing items from a woman named Mary Sullivan in December 1801. And I want to draw your attention specifically to the third and fourth lines of this receipt. These show that Miss Steele purchased an Egyptian dress and a Turkish crepe dress. And I just love this document because I often see fashion plates that reference the trend for Egyptian and Turkish dress around this time, but it's so rare to see evidence of a girl actually wearing these styles. And for me, this is especially exciting because dress was one way that girls engaged directly with imperial geographies. And here's an example of a girl from North Carolina engaging with styles that have been appropriated and filtered through an imperial lens. And finally, some correspondents provided helpful illustrations so that recipients of their letters would know exactly how to copy the latest trends. In a letter to his daughter, Susan, John Corliss described in detail the latest fashions for bonnets in Philadelphia. And this information and the drawing that accompanied it would no doubt have been useful to Susan, who was living with her family in Kentucky at the time. Correspondents also used dress as a gateway into discussing other topics, such as coming of age. So, for example, in 1840, Tristram Skinner commented on his friend Eliza Harwood's decision to wear long skirts following her 13th birthday. "I expect you look quite a different person from the one I took leave of in Norfolk last July. I suppose that when decked off in your two-flounce frock, I must say that I think your own short dresses are much more becoming to you. As the change would soon have take place, however, it is perhaps as well to commence your teens with a change." Some of the most interesting discussions of dress and textiles, however, come from letters exchanged between female peers. There's one set of letters in particular that provides a really interesting insight into how one group of girls thought about dress through the lens of romantic literature. In the letters of Victorine Dupont of Delaware, there are many comparisons made between actual dress and fictional costume. So, for example, in one letter, Victorine's friend, Rebecca Ralston, described the previous night's entertainments and complimented her own taste in dress using a quotation from James Thomson's popular series of poems, The Seasons. Your domestic friend was almost the only lady who thought she needed not the aid of foreign adornments, but wished to believe that she was, when unadorned, adorned the most. In their original context, these words describe the sartorial simplicity of Thomson's heroine, Lavinia. Although the daughter of a gentleman, Lavinia lived with her widowed mother in a rural cottage, protected from what Thomson described as the cruel, blasting arts of man. Dressed only in a simple robe, but in possession of a native grace, Lavinia won the heart of a gentleman named Palamon, who was the hero of her story. And while Victorine and her correspondents discussed many romantic poets and novelists, their favorite was no doubt Walter Scott. And while traveling with her father near Washington, D.C., Victorine spotted a family who seemed to emerge straight from the Scottish Highlands. We met this morning a Scotch family that quite charmed me. The boy had on a large scarf tied round his body of silken plaid. His mother told me that she had a complete Highland dress for him, with a bonnet and plume, that she often dressed him so because his father liked it. And coincidentally, Victorine's father had just bought her a new volume of Scott's poetry, which she began reading just after their encounter. In addition to discussing fashions, girls also employed each other as proxy shoppers, sometimes including samples of actual fabric in their letters to make sure their friends carried out their orders correctly. In this letter from Victorine to her sister Evelina, we see two swatches of fabric sewn into the page and incorporated into the text. Victorine discusses the échantillons, or samples, and gives Evelina, who was in Philadelphia at the time, instructions on what to purchase. And in addition to shopping for friends and family, girls also cemented effective ties through the exchange of clothing and other textile objects. In 1842, Tristram Skinner wrote again to his friend Eliza Harwood to describe the difficulty he had encountered while trying to find a pattern to send her so that she could fulfill her promise to work him a pair of suspenders. I did not forget my promise to supply you with a suspender pattern to occupy some of your leisure hours during the winter. I never was so bewildered by a little thing as when I attempted to choose them. There's a fine store in New York where they deal in nothing but worsted work, and they have all sorts of patterns, and you may judge that I found it difficult to make a choice when surrounded by hundreds of patterns and waited on by a pretty little German girl who could hardly speak English and who was beginning to be a little impatient at my delay. I send you 2 patterns with colors enough to work either of them, though not both. Through all of these examples, we can see that clothing and textiles played significant and multifaceted roles in the lives of elite white Southern girls. Girls formed a number of practical and emotional relationships to these objects. However, they almost never mention the labor that enabled them to possess and maintain such a wide array of textiles. Most of the girls mentioned here came from slaveholding families, and even those who didn't came from families who likely profited in some way from slavery. And while girls do occasionally mention enslaved people in their letters, there are almost no references to enslaved people as skilled textile workers. And this is a silence that's embedded into the sources that I've chosen to look at. And when looking at the archive of elite white Southern girlhood, it's important to pay attention to what girls chose not to record, as well as what they did. Thank you.
Thank Thank you very much indeed, Emily, for an absolutely fascinating paper. I'm going to hand over to Anna now and see if we've got any questions coming in yet. So please do post your questions in the chat box.
Okay, well, nothing's gone into the chat yet, but I've got a couple of questions, Emily, if that's okay. I'm really fascinated with the actual making of the items. So how they gathered the skills to do this. And I'm wondering if they used any published guides like the Workwoman's Guide, which was in circulation in this country, or whether they were using magazines or journals to sort of give them the fashionable vocabulary for stitchwork.
Yeah, that's something that I'm hoping to get more insight into as I continue to comb through the documents. Any mention to published works is few and far between. I have found a few references to magazines and publications of that sort. So I'm hoping to get a better sense of what these girls, like what publications they were subscribing to, and maybe draw some broader conclusions from that later on.
Okay, so Stephanie is asking, where on earth did you find these remarkable letters? Family collections. I love the samples actually sewn into the letter.
Yeah, well, they were primarily family collections in archives just kind of all over the South. And I go into a lot of personal papers, so not so much the kind of financial and business papers, although as you saw, I did look at some financial papers. But really just kind of going in and combing through, and really a lot of it is just flipping through adult correspondence, and then occasionally it's like, okay, there's a girl's letter, and then you flip through more adult correspondence, it's like, okay, there's a girl's letter. So in some cases, like in the case of Victorine DuPont, her and her sisters have this wonderful collection of correspondence that is collected and set aside. So that was really easy to go through because they have their own boxes. But yeah, it's really just traveling around and spending the time to just kind of go through and dig through the boxes.
Wow. So Lynn is asking, are there boarding school archives from this period which would throw some light on what was taught in terms of needlework?
Yeah, so I have visited a couple archives that are kind of dedicated to specific schools. The one that comes to mind, and unfortunately this material isn't quite as relevant as I've shifted further south, is the Westtown archive in Pennsylvania. So Westtown, of course, is the school that is responsible for the embroidered globes.
Oh, right, okay.
And it is relevant in that there were some Southern girls who attended Westtown, but the school itself isn't located in the South. But there are some schools, especially the ones who are still in operation, who have wonderful, wonderful records going, all the way back to their founding. Salem Female Academy in North Carolina is another one, again, still in operation. So yeah, there's a lot of boarding school archives.
Wow. And it's such valuable evidence of the actual wearing of specific fashion trends like the Egyptian craze and the Turkish. It's one thing to see them illustrated in Ackermans and another to actually, find a young woman purchase these things and presumably treasured them. Oh, that was absolutely amazing. How are we doing for time, Lynn?
Yeah, I think we probably should maybe forge ahead, Anna, but if people have got more questions as we go through the session that they'd like to come back to Emily on, please do put them in the chat function and we'll mop those up later. Anna and I will keep an eye on those and we'll keep a note of what's coming through. But thank you once again, Emily, for an absolutely fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
So I'd like to welcome our second speaker of the afternoon, who's also from North America, and that is Caroline Bellios. And Caroline is a professor of fashion design and history at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And her current research ranges from 19th century hair jewellery, embodiment and the transformative nature of touch to the potential of fashion in the museum space, the memory space and as a platform for connection and inclusivity. Her paper today explores changing attitudes towards hair work in the 19th century through the work of contemporary artists in the medium. Caroline, I'd like to pass over to you, and if you'd like to share your screen, please. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me to speak to you today. It looks like such a wonderful panel today and so well put together. I had hoped to really embrace the idea of an at-home and speak informally, but then I realized that I am very prone to digression. So I have written text, which I will be reading along to keep me better on time. And I was raised Greek Orthodox, and in the Orthodox Church, when someone dies, we say to their loved ones, "May her memory be eternal." I've come to truly value that phrase. It is neither meaningless nor untrue, but honors the person and their connection to us. May her memory be eternal. But how do we remember someone? How do we recall their face, their voice, their touch? Photographs are most certainly powerful, but they are images frozen in the corners of forgotten mirrors, the residue of someone else's gaze. And as many of us painfully discovered during high COVID, neither photograph nor video is truly enough connection. At one time, memory was accessed through body and touch rather than silver and shadow. The Victorians held on to their loved ones and their dead by holding onto a piece of the body, their hair. A time when hair that had been separated from the body elicited tenderness rather than the common recoil of today. In my yaya's solarium hung a photo of her from her childhood, of her family formally posed for the camera, an adult man and woman and 2 children in their Edwardian finery. But Yaya was the eldest of 3 children, and when this photo was taken, everyone in the young family was still alive. I asked her where the 3rd child was, and she explained that she was now the only one from the family left alive. Yaya didn't want to be the only living person in a photo full of dead people, a photo from long ago, yet one where she identified so strongly with the image that she felt to remain was to be surrounded by ghosts, so she had herself edited out. She was born in 1909, and in her youth, photography was still relatively new, but already a powerful image maker. But a photo is only a single moment unchanging. I am interested in the practice it eventually superseded. Before those frozen particles of light on paper and glass, one needed a way to remember and feel close. Hair occupies a liminal space between alive and dead, the part that appears to grow and lengthen, that we primp and style and lovingly caress is already dead. And then after the rest of the body joins our hair in death, after it begins to transform through decomposition, the hair just sits there and refuses to decay along with it. No wonder hair holds such fascination and seems to offer a bridge between the worlds. In Elizabeth Gitter's article, The Power of Women's Hair in the Victorian Imagination, she emphasized how the Victorians raised hair from a signifier of morality, an identifier of passion and danger, a seduction and comfort, and a place of contradiction capable of representing both the ordered and disordered woman, a text that explained her. The 19th century obsession with women's hair elevates the significance that an object made of hair would have had. But hair's close association to the language and mysteries of women, lesser beings in society, also devalues the worth of the skills and craft inherent in working hair. Hairwork pieces remaining today are almost always anonymous, parted from the names of their makers and their origins. I seek to better understand their stories by exploring the motivations and meanings of contemporary workers of hair, those among us still drawn to its eternally effective power. Although building on a different cultural tradition from the majority of the 19th century women who worked in hair, the inequity in devaluing things made by women or worn by women is further complicated in the work of artist Sonia Clark, who addresses the intersectional biases of reading Black women's hair. In her hair craft project, she asked hairdressers to work both on the familiar space of her head and the unfamiliar space of the canvas. Taking the work off of the head and onto the gallery wall illuminates the disparity in attention and respect we confer on the skills in making for the feminized surface of bodies and the skills in making for the masculine surface of buildings. The work of contemporary Black hairdressers brings visibility to what was once often, and today sometimes still legislated, to be unseen. In Western Europe, hair's textile nature has been employed in a variety of making processes, as simple as braids inserted in the groove of a ring, a curl tucked in a locket, or as a woven fabric under crystal. In palette work, hair functioned on a flat surface like paper or pigment, caressed into shapes before drying, depicting delicate scenes and lettering in an appropriately mournful sepia. But midway through the 19th century, three-dimensional ways of working with hair became fashionable. In gimp work, hair was twisted with wire to create strands that would hold the shapes of branches and flowers, an armature for wreaths and weeping trees, giving form to both grief and friendship. And finally, with table work, segments of hair were weighted and then braided, rope making mixed with bobbin lace done in the round. Hair work was no longer passive, contained by the locket or trapped under the crystal. The hair, representation of body and self, through the touch of human hands, became both the meaning and the vessel. It was in itself a body, and it came once again in personal contact with the skin of another human. In 1861, the Anglo-American communities suffered two major tragedies. The United States went to war against itself. No family was untouched by death. But also in 1861, Prince Albert died, and Queen Victoria led her country in decades of mourning. Being attired for mourning became unavoidable, and the necessarily became fashionable. Instead of mourning as the private act of an individual loss, it became the performance of a public one. Perhaps it is the public display of communal grief that supports the extraordinary shift in the making of mourning jewelry to a preference for embodied form. A bold and unmissable declaration, not hidden inside a ring or on the back of a pin, but bare and raw, visible and voluminous. The sensuous touch of hair again on the skin, heightening the memories more than a glance through a crystal ever could. Every act of touching becomes embedded within us. Susan Stewart tells, the body bears a somatic memory of its encounters with what is outside of it. To be in contact with an object is to be moved by it, and this pressure perceived by touch involves an actual change. We are changed, and so is the object. The maker affects change upon the hair, twisting and braiding it into patterns, sculpting its forms and volumes, but the hair in return is changing the fingers of the maker. Thin filaments gripped between the whirls of fingerprints, the strands transferring knowledge of a life lived as witness, and in the very texture of those prints, perhaps remembering the first human weavings, impressions left only on ancient clay and etched on the tips of our fingers. Artist Jane Wildgoose explores not only how the objects of the dead, in this case hairwork, might be read as text or contain a story, but also how the objects themselves are witnesses, testifying their stories for those willing to listen. Her listening takes the form of making to know, creating to understand. When I subsequently began to work with hair, I found myself experiencing an intimate impression of each donor and a strong sense of connection with the person who had given it, whether I knew her or not. A piece of hair work may be those two bodies touching, or three: the donor of the hair, the maker of the piece, and a third potential body, that of the wearer. This connection is highlighted by Marcia Poynton. The hair bracelet mingles with the hair from which the jewelry is made with the hair on the arms of the wearer. She emphasizes the two absent bodies of the donor and the substance, and that of the wearer of the bracelet are bound together. Each time a piece is lifted and secured in place, the hands of the lover come in contact with the hair of the loved. A man might caress his wife's hair each time he removed his watch from its pocket, her tresses reminding him of her affection, or perhaps he felt they bound him to his newly essential measuring device of mortality. Even without a watch, I see the passage of time in these works made of hair. Like all textile works, they are diaries. The diaries of women who didn't leave behind words to tell their stories. For those not encouraged to share or record their experiences and thoughts, their stories are found in the things made by hands. Women's days are not meted out in entries written under dates, but measured in the space between one knot and another. I never met my great-grandmother, Yaya Fanny, of the fine Edwardian family portrait. I only know her from occasional stories, 2 photographs, a dress, and the work of her own hands. I have numerous doilies, each made of circles formed of a thread knotted and wound around itself. Her hands created every knot, every twist. Her story is in the path of those threads. Her touch transformed the fibers into a record of her emotions and her life. I sit with them, sometimes hoping they will talk to me, touching where she touched, feeling for her stories. Each piece of hairwork offers the same feast of Tantalus, identities and stories within my grasp and yet still out of reach. Viewing hair jewelry and wreaths as active and performative embed the maker and the memory of the maker's actions in the piece. Touch and time define the final outcome, creating the bridge from one body to another. Artist Anne Wilson explores the roles of hair in mourning in her series Hair Cloth Works. She highlights the domestic and societal position of women by using discarded linens from the home, linens that have holes and tears. Her work is rooted in handwork and here in mending, mending through attention. The holes are not closed and hidden, their violent history blending into the surface as a healing scar, but are amplified wounds, acknowledged by the stitching and outlining the area of trauma with individual strands of hair. Each hair a piece of a body offered in healing and support, embedded within the surface, strengthening rather than erasing. My yaya's photographs haunt me and confuse me. I peer at them endlessly, looking for meaning and understanding. When she was laid out for her memorial service, yes, I took a photo, but I also asked for a lock of her hair. Her hair is my yaya, the hair of a little girl airbrushed out of a family haunting, hair I had watched her comb and curl and uncurl just before leaving the house, hair tied under a sheer nylon scarf while baking, a plastic kerchief in the rain. Her lock of hair didn't trap one moment and one memory of her life. It is all the moments, all the memories. These pieces of Victorian hairwork are the people they belong to, both the living and the dead. They are bodies twined together, love and loss inseparable, the touch of making, bonding, and binding them forever. They witness the act of living and measure the time of mourning. Some extant hair samples are of the famous, but most represent ordinary people. Their only outstanding quality that made them suitable for memorialization was having been loved by another. In fact, to many, they are worth nothing now except shock. They are used as the freak show of the museum, pulled out to surprise and titillate modern visitors, curious reminders of how weird and morbid our predecessors were. They weren't weird or morbid. They were preserving memories, though, the stories of those they loved. A lesson in human connection we only remembered when our permission to touch was taken away. The materiality of their hair symbolized the eternal in the human, transformed by hands and work and time, and when worn close to the skin, shaped by the breath and sweat of the living. They and their identities are long gone, the loved and those that loved them, but they were well remembered through the comforting touch of one body to another. May their memories be eternal. Thank you.
Caroline, many thanks for an absolutely wonderful paper. I mean, as somebody who absolutely loves hair work, I do have a couple of pieces, Victorian pieces actually, that are rings or a bracelet with hair work. And I mean, as I said to her, I'm wearing hair earrings today. But it was interesting talking to Nina Spar, who's the maker of this pair of earrings. She said she finds quite a lot of customers recoil from it and they don't like the idea of wearing hair. Have you found that come as a response from the makers, contemporary makers whom you've spoken to?
No. The makers that I've spoken to, I feel that they embrace hair as this site of feminine work and feminine representation, and so utilize it as a tool to better tell the artistic stories that they're working on. And I think there's a lack of, as I'm sure we all know, a lack of recognition and respect for work that might be deemed as work done in the home or work considered craft or work that when touched by women then becomes somehow less valuable. And so I think that it is a part of this reclaiming and celebrating of things that are attached to the idea of femininity.
Right, because I mean, sorry, I don't want to hog the questions, but I just find it fascinating because as an embroiderer and someone who teaches historic stitch, I'm fascinated by the use of hair. I mean, I don't see it from a memorialization point of view. I look at it from, it's another thread that I'm working with. So if I'm working on, 17th century raised work, much of the hair that appears in the sort of figures in the compositions, I'm looking at that silk thread, but it's also combined with real hair because it, creates a wonderful effect. So it's fascinating to me from that point of view. And I appreciate the skill that goes into manipulating the hair just as much as I can appreciate the memorialization of somebody. And it may seem strange buying that jewelry today when I know nothing about the person whose hair is in it, but it has that special message often if it's connected also with initials or if there happens to be something engraved in the ring. But I'm going to pass over to Anna because I see we've got lots of other questions.
We've got a lot of questions come in about your incredibly moving, powerful talk, which has had a few of us feeling positively filled with emotion. Kate would like you to just focus a little bit on the historical moment when some sort of shift took place between the acceptance of hairwork as a tool for memorialization and the visceral recoiling from it. What happened then?
What I claim in what I cut out of this paper, because 12 minutes, is I think that it really had to do with the obsession with cleanliness that was happening at the end of the 19th century. And the idea that all of a sudden that hair removed from the body was something that was no longer acceptable to keep around the house, that it had to do with changing fashion, that parts of women's bodies became exposed that were covered with hair, and then removing hair became something that was fashionable. And so any hair that wasn't on your head all of a sudden was not attractive and not desirable. I think that the growth of the funeral industry, where death left the home and went into an industrialized space, made us less comfortable with touching bodies in a lot of ways. I think also the photograph gave us a different way of engaging with and remembering people and thinking about people that we loved, even though we could have had little miniatures before. There was something universal and democratic about the photograph that hadn't been available before, that hair had given you access to. And I think, as I often think a lot about World War I and how the world just changed. And there was so much pain after that war and during that war that there was such a shift in how we thought about death and how we engaged with memory of death.
Interesting. There are lots of comments in the chat, which I'm sure people are reading, about personal circumstances and how people relate to what you're talking about. I mean, death is something we all know something about. Katie shared very poignantly that she has her late husband's ponytail that she is hoping to do some work with. Lots of thank you for a beautiful presentation. Azadeh would like to know, is this work published? I want to refer to it in my own research and practice. Is it?
No, not yet. But maybe soon?
Oh, please.
I'm working on it.
You're working on it. Good.
Yeah,
Watch
thank you
this.
very much.
Will you let us know?
Yes.
Kimberly particularly likes the idea of freak show as the term you used, and how hair became marginalized and freakified. Can you speak a bit more about the abject body and how this features in these items? Can you speak a bit more about how the abject body features into these items for contemporary viewers? Okay.
Oh, that's an interesting way to approach it. I think about spaces in museums and ways to get people to engage with objects that are removed from everyday use or from everyday understanding of a contemporary life. And I think about people who walk through exhibitions with corsets in them, and the comment is always like, oh my gosh, those look so painful. And it's this contemporary projection onto this object that they don't really understand. And I think that it is both useful to get people engaged with collections of objects, to have things that elicit a strong response. And if that response is disgust and recoil, or if that response is beauty and attraction, either way, it starts to engage the viewer to then want to know more. So I don't wish to kind of dismiss perhaps those in museums who may in fact pull out the Hairwork and be like, and this, do you know what it's made out of? Because frankly, I do that with a collection I work with, where I pull out a monkey fur purse and I ask my students, what do you think this is made out of? And they, they actively recoil when I tell them it's monkey. And I think that in the same way that we enjoy watching horror films, that things that scare us or make us uncomfortable also form a part of who we are as a human being, and that these pieces of bodies can both repel us and draw us in closer to different ways of discussing things in the museum or in the home.
Interesting. So here's a really interesting comment from Pat, which kind of follows on from this. And Pat says, I have two purses from 1700 woven in hair, silver and gold. Definitely not a memorial, in my opinion, but certainly durable and unique to the maker. One is very likely a gaming token purse. So that really focuses in on the, what the material can provide in terms of tensile strength and a fine stitching thread, which Lynn would probably like to work with. It's an amazing material.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that you probably have to move on. If I can just say that one of the things that I think does often get overlooked in discussions of hairwork, and even in what I presented today, is that the hair wreaths typically aren't memorial. Typically, it's like collecting pictures of all your friends and putting them together in one place. And so it's like a joyful, like, just, hey, give me a piece of your hair, and then I make something out of it. And then I have this little reminder of my friend in this beautiful handiwork. And so that the people who were working with hair at the time were not always doing so out of loss or longing, but also just out of friendship and family. And I love the fact that it serves all of those different purposes.
That's a lovely note to end on, actually. It is quite universal in its uses. Thank you very much indeed, Caroline. And if there are more questions coming in, we'll get back to those later. So I'd like to introduce our third speaker of the afternoon, which is Steph Haire, who's a graduate of the University of Glasgow's Dress and Textile History's MLit programme. Her research interests include 19th century textile handicrafts, in particular embroidery and quilting. And Steph's paper this afternoon explores the work of the Scottish arts and crafts artist and embroiderer Phoebe Traquair, and I'm really looking forward to this because I love Traquair's work. So I'd like to pass over to you, Emily, if you'd like to, Steph, if you'd like to share your screen, please.
Well, hi everyone. Thank you very much for having me. As Lynn said, I'm going to be talking to you today about the artist Phoebe Traquair. So I'm going to introduce you to who she was. I'm going to use her series of embroidered works, The Progress of a Soul, to examine the role that embroidery played in forming her identity, both as an artist and as a woman. I'm going to explore how the contemporary gendered art versus craft dichotomy affected her embroidery practice and how this materialized in her choice of location for her embroidery frame. So who was Phoebe Traquair? Anyone who might not know, she was one of Scotland's first professional female artists, and arguably its leading arts and crafts artist at the end of the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th. Born in 1852 in Ireland, she trained at art school and moved to Edinburgh when she married a Scottish paleontologist. A talented, multidisciplinary artist who worked across oil painting, embroidery, bookbinding, mural painting, enameling, she was also a middle-class wife and mother of 3 children. So although she's probably most famous for her huge painted murals decorating some of Edinburgh's buildings, it's her visual treatment of embroidery as a medium equal to painting that really singles her out, in my opinion. She created large-scale pictorial embroideries that shared many aesthetic conventions with her paintings. However, as we'll see, her relationship with embroidery was often contradictory and remained bound by 19th century conventions. So at this point, it's worth noting that, in my opinion, Traquair's work is under-researched by scholars other than Dr. Elizabeth Cumming. She's really the best source of information, and so as well as archival material, this presentation is quite heavily draws on her research. So on the screen is her main book about Traquair, but she's got several publications. So now I'm going to show you what I consider to be Traquair's masterpiece, The Progress of a Soul. Not only are these embroideries representative of her style of art needlework as a whole, they're incredibly technically impressive. Stitched somewhere between 1893 and 1902, each one measures over 2 meters high and took around 2 years to embroider. They were done using a masterful blend of opus Anglicanum techniques and more modern stitches. So The Progress of a Soul is actually the story of a human's journey through life and all its trials to the eventual embrace of death. Based on a Walter Pater tale, these embroideries are Traquair's own interpretation of the narrative. She uses Pater's character of Denny as a vehicle to further her career-long exploration of the nature of the human soul and overarching themes of time, justice, and Christianity. As a religious, thoughtful, and introspective woman, these were all very personal themes. Now, I'm not going to dwell too much on all the symbolism that's rife within these pieces because I'd need a much longer presentation, but rather I'm going to use them as a kind of case study for Traquair's complicated relationship with needlework. So earlier I said that she treated embroideries aesthetically like paintings, but what does that mean in practice? So if we take some panels from The Progress of a Soul, shown here on the left, and compare them with Pan, one of her later oil paintings shown on the right, we can immediately see that scale, composition, colour, and subject matter are all very similar. So visually, she uses stitch and paint in comparable ways. She even signed her embroideries with an artistic signature conventionally reserved for painting, as you can see here. And a quick apology for the picture quality. The Progress of a Soul is currently kept in the National Gallery of Scotland stores. It's basically a big warehouse and the light in there just really didn't make for great pictures, but I've done my best. So her use of this signature indicates that she saw these panels as works of fine art. But despite believing in what she termed the quote-unquote indivisibility of the arts, in practice, she kept embroidery and painting separate. Whereas she would work on her paintings on site or in her studio, embroidery was done exclusively at home in the evenings by candlelight in her leisure time. So to begin to understand this conflicting attitude, it's helpful to understand her career up to this point and the contextual gendered world in which she was working. And so while I talk, I'm just going to leave some more of my close-up photos of the embroideries on the screen, just so that you can hopefully fall in love with them as much as I have. So Traquair's path to professional artistry was by no means a smooth one. Although she was an undeniably privileged white woman with an art school background, once she married in 1873 and became a mother, she largely ceased her art practice for a while. According to her contemporary W.B. Yeats, this was because her husband actually forbade her to paint. And now this was unfortunately not unusual for middle-class women at the time. Society saw their place as within the home, with domesticity as their only acceptable means to social success. However, once her children were older, we do start to see her return to creativity, first and foremost through embroidery. So needlework was a skill that Traquair, like most women and girls in the 19th century and previously, had learnt at a young age to be put to good use for the benefit of her home and family. Contemporary commentators saw embroidery as an essentially feminine craft, inherently suited to women's delicate temperaments, and much like women themselves, domestic and confined to the home. Therefore, Traquair was able to continue working on embroideries without challenging the equilibrium of her family life. And so tentatively resuming her art practice first with embroidery within the structure of the home may have facilitated an easier transition back to an artistic career and identity. Now, the wider artistic and gendered context within which she was working treated embroidery and painting as two very different categories of creativity. Painting was considered one of the quote-unquote superior high arts, whereas embroidery was seen as one of the inferior applied arts. Even within the arts and crafts movement, which endeavoured to overturn this hierarchy, a division of labour existed, derived from perceptions of craft like embroidery as women's work. A select few of Traquair's contemporaries were actively working to transform this perception of embroidery by employing it as an art medium and challenging its aesthetic conventions. However, it often remained the case that artistic women who embroidered or otherwise worked with the needle arts were not taken seriously by their contemporaries, even as part of a movement that ostensibly set out to exalt the status of the applied arts. So this division of artistic disciplines means that Traquair's embroideries were often overlooked in favour of her painted works by her reviewers. And although she herself believed in the indivisibility of the arts, even as a multidisciplinary artist, she struggled to transcend the hierarchical divisions extant in the art world. And it was perhaps even her own treatment of embroidery as equal to painting that kept her relegated to the rank of amateur in the eyes of her peers. As women were expected to be able to embroider, and many gentlewomen would spend their leisure time in this way, the artistic pursuit of the medium was often regarded as amateurish. Traquair was never permitted to become a professional member of the Royal Scottish Academy on the grounds that she was not, quote-unquote, professional, only eventually being granted an honorary membership in 1920. For this reason, the paradoxical nature of Traquair employing embroidery as part of her art practice in itself reinforced stereotypical notions about Victorian women and women artists in the eyes of her contemporaries. Traquair herself even appears to have been reluctant to divorce embroidery from its status as a domestic art form. As I mentioned earlier, her embroidery work was done in the evenings at home, relegated to the domestic sphere. And now it should be acknowledged that the domestic sphere in the 19th century could be fluid between a private and public setting, and other female arts and crafts artists enjoyed using home studios for the flexibility they provided. Home studios allowed married middle-class women artists to efficiently tend to both domestic and artistic work during the day, and to combine their role as domestic hostess with marketing their artwork. However, this does not seem to have been the case for Traquair. She hated entertaining and showing her work in a domestic arena, and her letters to her nephew kept in the collection of the National Library of Scotland are testament to this. In one letter, for instance, Traquair recorded that she sometimes relied on her maids to show her work for her. Now, this indicates that her domestic and professional worlds may not have been as fluid and as integrated for her peers. And her choice to keep her embroidery practice within a domestic setting may also indicate a deeply personal connection with the medium and the subject matter that she chose to portray. Elizabeth Cumming even believes that The Progress of a Soul was intended as an expression of personal experience. A deep connection with these pieces is evidenced by Traquair's reticence to effectively market them commercially. At exhibitions, she actually had a tactic of overpricing the works to ensure she wouldn't have to part with them. For example, when The Progress of a Soul was exhibited at the 1903 Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society in London, the price that she gave them was £1,000, which is about the equivalent of £130,000 today. So while I definitely think that there's a debate about the value of textile art to be had there, it is true that the pieces didn't sell at that price, and Traquair went on to use them as decoration for a staircase in her own home. However, exhibiting them in this way meant that Traquair achieved international recognition, establishing herself as a leader in the arts and crafts movement through the medium of embroidery. So to conclude, Phoebe Anna Traquair was a pioneering artist who used embroidery as an art medium to communicate her ideas and represent her artistic voice. However, it is impossible to separate her needlework from the context in which it was made. While her art embroideries are equally as visually and technically accomplished as her high art murals and oil paintings, they are inextricably linked to her domestic identity as a 19th century wife and mother. Her treatment of embroidery as a pursuit confined to the home colours any interpretation of her stitched works as pieces of fine art and of her relationship with them. Despite the public exhibition of many of her embroideries, their birth within her domestic sphere and their eventual return to it means that an analysis of them solely as fine art loses much nuance. Needlework as a medium has many such dualities and contradictions. It's creative as well as functional, domestic as well as an avenue to professionalism, and both a tool for women's oppression as well as their liberation. However, this makes Traquair's embroideries a unique vehicle for the construction and interpretation of her personal and professional identities. They synthesize her artistic practice with her domestic identity, connecting two disparate strands of her life and encompassing what it meant to be Phoebe Ann Traquair in the 19th century. Thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Steph, for a wonderful introduction to Phoebe Anna Traquair's work. I wonder, in your researches, have you managed to find out any information about her training as an embroiderer? Because, I mean, obviously, when she's using silk threads, it's very much in a painterly style, but her use of gold work shows somebody who's clearly very, very skilled from a technical point of view. So do we know anything about her training? Or is she taught?
So as far as I know, her art school education focused mostly on painting. And how she met her husband was because she was doing scientific watercolors for his research work. So as far as I'm aware, her education was not an art school one when it came to needlework, but I might be wrong.
Right, okay, now that's really interesting. Anna, I'm going to pass over to you just to see if there are any questions coming in. I mean, I've got lots of questions I'd like to ask, but I'm conscious I don't want to hog the show, and I'm sure there'll be other opportunities for Steph and I to have a chat anyhow, so I'm going to pass over to you.
Okay, so Robin has got right in with a good question. I am fascinated by that anecdote about value. Do we know if she set high prices on any of her other work? Could it have been a comment on the perceived value of her work that went into them, as someone who didn't have to worry about these as an income source? Okay, so how did she set her prices?
So it does seem to be that on these bigger pieces, she set the prices intentionally so that she could keep them, but still exhibit professionally. But I definitely agree that had she had to rely on them for income, that may not have been the case. But I mean, to me, £130,000 is not a wild price for such incredible, huge pieces that took so long to make. But obviously at the time there was a very different value on them, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, it's interesting to put it in the context of the pieces that are being produced by the Royal School of Art and Needlework at the time. For instance, the school's interpretation of Pomona, designed by Burne-Jones and William Morris, which was stitched under May Morris's direction, that was valued at £300. And that's a piece on a similar scale to Phoebe Anna Traquair's work. The pieces that went to the Philadelphia Centennial, the most expensive was $350, and that was for a massive hanging that was 16 feet high and 12 feet wide. So that gives you something to compare with here. So Phoebe Anna Traquair was clearly pricing because she did not want those pieces to sell. They were private pieces, and the figure that's put on them is irrelevant, really, because they're not there for sale, they're not there for purchase.
Exactly, and she took them home and hung them along her staircase where she could see them every single day. So
she wanted to hang on to them. So Kate is asking, did she also produce smaller pieces, or were they all on this rather large heroic scale?
So she did produce some smaller pieces, particularly earlier in her career. The V&A has got a nice collection of some smaller bits. There's a really lovely table cover but they're very much more domestic items. And the National Museum has got some more of her giant panels that are kind of comparable to the Progress of a Soul, but it does seem that she liked to focus more when it came to art anyway, on the larger panels. But then again, there's a huge conversation to be had there about art versus domestic craft when it comes to needlework.
So people are very inspired by what you've shown us. Z wants to get her needles out.
Fantastic.
Start embroidering. Helen wants you to tell us a bit more about Traquair's reputation and a response to her work when exhibited. Was there a difference between the way her paintings were perceived and the miniatures and her embroideries?
Absolutely. So she was very well reviewed, particularly by James Corr, the art critic, who does appreciate her needlework, but in his reviews he very much focuses on her paintings and her other pieces. And I think that's just sort of reflective of the attitude of the time. People definitely saw them and thought that they were beautiful, but when it came to art critics' reception, they set a lot more store by her high art pieces.
Right. Which you can kind of predict, can't you? What about her artist contemporaries, and particularly female artist contemporaries? Were there any conversations or discussions that you put your finger on yet?
So I haven't found any evidence in the manuscript archive at the National Library that she was having any conversations with other female needlework artists. Obviously, Anne Macbeth and Jessie Newbury were her contemporaries over in Glasgow, but there doesn't seem to be any connection there. And of course, their styles are very different. But what we do see is that she corresponds with a lot of men of the era, artists, writers, sort of famous men of that kind. And she would reach out to them if she didn't know them. But you don't seem to see as much evidence of it with women, which I think is a shame.
Kimberly's asking you to expand a little bit more on Traquair's efforts to keep a hold of the pieces she particularly loved. What do you think was going on there?
I mean, obviously, it's very difficult when you can't ask the person, but I think we can safely assume that she was very proud of them and loved them, but particularly also made them with a return to her home in mind. They were designed to be domestic ornaments, and because I think particularly the pieces that I was talking about today, they are very personal themes to her. And so it is very possible that she had just made them with the intention that she would keep them for a very specific position in her home.
Do we know what her family felt about her work?
No, apart from the fact that early in their marriage, her husband forbade her from making art. Not really. She had a very close relationship with one of her nephews, and a lot of what survives in her own words is actually from the letters that she wrote to him. He also became an artist, and so I think they had a very close sort of creative relationship for that reason. But unfortunately, I don't know much more than that, other than that Ramsay Heatley Traquair was initially not that into it.
And I think we're probably going to have to move on, given how the time is going, but great to have so much response to all the speakers so far. Thank you very much indeed, again, Steph, for a wonderful talk. Our final paper this afternoon is from Dr. Sheilagh Quaile. And as I've mentioned at the start, and those of us who have been joining us late, Sheilagh is in Canada, which is being beset by Storm Fiona this weekend. So she has no Wi-Fi access. So I've got a recording of Sheilagh's paper, which I will be sharing, and hope that technically all that will work out. Sheilagh is an early career historian and art historian specialising in global 19th century textiles and design. And part of her doctoral thesis, which was completed in 2020, was published recently in the Journal of Design History. Her paper this afternoon explores imitation and piracy in Paisley shawl design in the 19th century.
Hello, everyone. My presentation is titled Paisley Pattern Pirates, Copying in 19th Century Shawl Design. As a result of increased trade between Asia and Europe, handloom woven shawls from the Kashmir region of the Indian subcontinent became desirable clothing for wealthy Europeans during the mid-18th century. By the 1770s, European manufacturers had picked up on this trend, producing textiles that imitated Asian patterns, but sold at lower prices to meet a wider market. Kashmiri textiles and their imitations were prevalent in Britain by the mid-19th century and were particularly favored by women as an outer layer of clothing. The European shawl fashion lasted for about a century, dwindling in the 1870s as fashions changed. In this short presentation, I will examine the imitation Kashmiri shawl industry of one of the most prominent centres of European production, the town of Paisley, Scotland, to question the artistic innovation of its products. Using Paisley as a case study, I will address the political and moral issue of copying in the context of the British Empire. How much did Paisley's pattern drawers, as the industry's designers were then called, rely on the designs of their competitors, both Asian and European, to produce their own work? To answer this question, I will examine the pattern drawer's training and sources. I will discuss the role of imitation in pattern drawers' work. As I will explain, pattern piracy was par for the course in 19th century textile manufacturing, but recourse was not available to everyone. European imitation of Kashmiri shawls was first taken up by manufacturers in cities and towns with prominent textile industries, such as Edinburgh from 1777, Norwich from the 1780s, Paris and Lyon in France from the early 19th century, and Paisley from 1805. Despite being a relative latecomer to the industry, by 1820, Paisley was one of the foremost European centres of imitation Kashmiri shawl manufacture. Paisley became so well known for the production of imitation Kashmiri shawls that by the mid-19th century, the town's name was synonymous in much of the English-speaking world with the shawl's characteristic bota motif, bota being a Persian word meaning bush or shrub. Before the 19th century, textile patterns in Paisley were usually devised by weavers, foremen, or manufacturers themselves. According to Paisley shawl manufacturer William Cross, the introduction of the imitation Kashmiri shawl to Paisley in 1805 encouraged increased specialization in local textile manufacturing, including the emergence of professional designers. By 1800, pattern drawing had become a separate profession within other long-standing British textile industries, such as printed calicos, which had been produced since the mid-18th century. The division of labor allowed for greater output, which was important to British textile industries in the first half of the 19th century as they acquired new consumer markets abroad. New overseas markets in North and South America, Africa, India, and China preferred cheap, bold, and colorful patterns. By the 1830s and 1840s, the domestic market had changed as well. The middle and lower middle classes had become increasingly urbanized and enjoyed greater disposable income. This compelled manufacturers to expedite production of cheap household and personal products such as wallpaper, metalware, and textiles. In these market conditions, those who mass-produced figured textiles at low cost flourished. Most Paisley manufacturers attended to the lower end of the figured textile market as compared to manufacturers in Norwich and Edinburgh, and especially in France, who concentrated on luxury products. This became a strength of Paisley's industry because local weavers were paid less than elsewhere in Britain. In his account on the stylistic evolution of the Paisley shawl, published in 1872, Cross stated that pattern drawers were either, quote, trained to the business or naturally gifted with the requisite talents, end quote. Census returns show that, as with much labor in local textile manufacturing, pattern drawing was often a family affair, with teenage children and wards apprenticing with their parent or guardian. Others would have been trained by more senior pattern drawers who were either freelance or who worked under the same employer. Pattern drawers' training would have been skills-based rather than creative. To keep wages low and ensure that the manufacturer had control over pattern's appearance, pattern drawers were usually tasked with copying minutely and accurately and making alterations to existing patterns as their employers requested. This might include making changes to a purchased pattern, a pattern copied from the current market in order to evade copyright, or a pattern from their back catalogue for novelty or to update an older fashion to suit current tastes. Altering existing patterns was economically advantageous because it allowed manufacturers to only release the sorts of patterns that they knew were in demand, and therefore avoid the risk of failure associated with releasing a completely novel pattern. Further information on pattern drawing comes from the report of the House of Commons Select Committee on Copyright of Designs in 1840, which preceded the extension on copyright protection for decorative patterns in Britain from 1842. Patterns registered under this legislation can be found in the Board of Trade Design Registers at the National Archives of the United Kingdom, as discussed by Olivia in her presentation in the June At Home. In his evidence before the committee, freelance pattern drawer Thomas Holdway, who worked in the Edinburgh and Paisley shawl industries, explained that it was necessary not just from a business perspective, but from an artistic one for pattern drawers to consult other patterns to inspire new work. His evidence testifies to the difficulty of maintaining a conceptual dichotomy between copy and original, imitation and innovation. When asked whether he consulted other designs to create his own work, Holdway replied, quote, "I consider that a person ought to have a good collection of designs, that he may vary his own. It is by seeing designs that he is enabled to do so." End quote. For visual reference, there were a number of sources that pattern drawers could turn to. British manufacturers and pattern drawers often purchased patterns from French designers, who were regarded as producing better quality work. These visual sources helped to inform British manufacturers about French trends and allowed them to expand the stylistic range of their products. The British also tended to copy the French because the French were earlier to adopt the jacquard mechanism to their looms, which facilitated the creation of complex designs. Introduced to shawl weaving in the late 1810s, the jacquard loom automated much of the weaving process using a series of perforated cards. However, the card paper's high import duty in Britain contributed to the machine's delayed uptake there. It was not adopted on a wide scale in Paisley until the mid-1840s. Thus, the French produced more complex designs earlier and took the lead in European shawl design. However, the main pattern source was Kashmiri shawls themselves. Looking to Kashmir and wider Asia for visual inspiration throughout the course of the shawl industry, French and British manufacturers sometimes simply studied and imitated these foreign patterns, but frequently traced and replicated them in their entirety. Although French and British manufacturers also replicated patterns by other French and British manufacturers, some perceived this to be an economic threat and accordingly labeled it piracy. This word was not applied to the replication of Asian patterns. And, although French and Prussian manufacturers registered their patterns for copyright protection in Britain, no Asian patterns are listed in either the Board of Trade Design Registers for Class 7 printed shawls or for Class 8 other shawls within the National Archives. This disparity in access to legal protection, which went unacknowledged in the report from the Select Committee on Copyright of Designs of 1840, reflects either negligence or reluctance to consider Asian designers as deserving of the same intellectual property rights. Paisley shawl manufacturers such as Robert Kerr openly admitted to replicating Asian patterns. In 1849, Kerr reported to the House of Commons Select Committee on the School of Design that he produced both original patterns and copies in his shawls. He opined that the best pattern sources came from India and observed that patterns which Paisley manufacturers copied from the French were usually copies of Indian patterns themselves. blame should not be placed on textile producers alone. This economy was also encouraged by consumers. Artistic originality and quality weren't important to British markets, which valued affordability and popular colors. This was observed by some involved in textile manufacturing at the time, who argued that, contrary to public perception, British artisans did not lack artistic taste or ability. Nevertheless, it remains that there was a moral and legal disparity in replicating European versus Asian patterns. I contend that this is an under-acknowledged artistic aspect to Britain's import substitution of Asian goods during the 18th and 19th centuries, and to Britain's rise as the dominant player in world textile production from then until the 20th century. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to responding to your questions and comments. You can reach me on Twitter at Sheilagh Quaile or by email at 14sq@queensu.ca. Take care, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Sheilagh. I hope that you're there. You are, I can see you, excellent. So if you'd like to unmute yourself, and I'm going to pass over straight to Anna to pick up on the chat there.
Okay, so I'm waiting for questions to come in for Sheilagh. If anybody's got anything they want to ask, pop it in the chat or just raise your hand and I'll put it to you to put it to Sheilagh. Anybody got anything in the meantime? I've got one coming from Kate. Were any of the Asian designers ever successful in prosecuting for copyright?
So can you say that again? It just, the sound just cut out.
Sorry, I'll come a bit closer. Were any of the Asian designers ever successful in prosecuting for copyright?
That's an interesting question. I have not seen anything to suggest that they really engaged with this copyright process. That would be something to look into, certainly, though. I would like to do more research into the Asian side and see whether people were aware of this disparity or not.
Yeah, and in fact, following on from that, Anne is asking, well, how would the Asian designers have known that their work was being copied? You know, what sort of crossover was there in understanding of the designs and patterns of consumption?
There was a lot of crossover in terms of design. Asian designers also copied from European designers. I was just interested that in Europe, there was outrage over copying from European designers, but I didn't find any mention of the same kind of moral panic over copying from Asian designers. It was acceptable. So I thought that was a bit strange. And you know, some will say that copying was certainly part of textile design at the time. They didn't have the same concerns over cultural appropriation that we have today, and that in many different forms of art and craft, copying has been part of the learning process, and is often used in textile production. But yeah, what I was interested in was the debate around this practice and why it was regarded as so different between East and West, between copying from European versus Asian manufacturers.
Do you think that there were any questions in the minds of the consumer as to what they were consuming was, we can't really apply the same terms, can we, authentic or inauthentic? I mean, how is this whole matter negotiated?
I don't think consumers cared, really. I think that design reformers in Britain certainly cared. There was a lot of panic over questions about the quality of British design, and also people pointing to the extent of copying and piracy in British textile design. But I don't think that original patterns mattered to consumers, and I think that was what some manufacturers considered to be threatening. That was that people would buy pirated patterns. It wasn't a concern. People, if we're talking about authenticity, people certainly still valued Asian textiles, which is why European manufacturers would often sometimes embroider signatures into or Urdu text to make it look like their shawls were actually made somewhere in South Asia. So they had lots of little tricks like that to try and trick consumers into thinking that they were buying an authentic Indian product when in fact they were buying a copy or a fabrication, as it were.
There's a great question here from Anne.
Yeah.
I was wondering if this copying was evident in the designs displayed in the Great Exhibition. The Indian exhibitors would have seen British exhibits.
That's a very interesting question. I'm not sure. I've noticed that there's a difference in the way that I'm not sure about the Great Exhibition specifically, but there's a difference in the way that designers are acknowledged as well, based on whether they're from Europe or from India. Generally, actually, the designers themselves weren't mentioned, but the manufacturer was always mentioned if it was European. And if the shawl or textile in question was Asian, a lot of the time exhibitions would only list the patron, generally a royal patron. And sometimes they would list the European person who had commissioned that shawl. So Europeans would they'd have agents in Kashmir who took an active hand in the design process to create shawls that they could then sell back in Europe based on European taste. So I have noticed that they don't tend to list those involved in manufacturing Kashmiri shawls. Part of that could be because Kashmir had a different system where, for a long time, especially under the Mughals, the patron was emphasized. But I did think that was sort of strange that European manufacturers are mentioned, but nobody really seemed to be particularly interested in mentioning the consumer or the producer in India. As long as it was an authentic Indian shawl, that seemed to be the most important thing.
Interesting. Annette is asking, so did the Paisley manufacturers produce other patterns copying other cultural designs?
Yes, there were copies of Chinese patterns and other types of patterns from South Asia and Persia, and I think those are the ones that were really mainly copied. And the schools of design, including the School of Design in Paisley, purchased Persian and South Asian textiles for this reason, so that they could copy and learn from these patterns. And even Queen Victoria donated Kashmiri shawls to Paisley manufacturers or loaned them so that they could then learn from these patterns, and I suspect often replicate them.
It's a really interesting question from Kimberly about the nature of pattern. Sheilagh, do you think there is something particular about patterns that lends itself to this material and symbolic extraction that is such a clear example of Orientalism?
Yes, that's been discussed, especially in a book chapter by Anandi Ramamurthy, who thought that this sort of stylistic change in what we refer to as the Paisley pattern, once it was being mimicked by a lot of European manufacturers, it sort of took on more of an elongated shape. So Ramamurthy argued that reflected Orientalist perceptions about the sensuality of the Orient. and they would contrast it with the rationality of the West. There are others who differ.
Oh, Sheilagh, I think we've lost the connection again. So I think actually, Anna, given how we are for time, because it is coming up to 3:30, I mean, and I didn't want to stop because we had absolutely 4 wonderful presentations. Sorry, Sheilagh, we lost you there. I think what I'm going to suggest is that if anybody has got any follow-up questions, I'm sure the speakers would be absolutely delighted to share their contact details with you, and if you'd like to follow that up. I'm just going to say a huge thank you to all 4 speakers for absolutely wonderful, thought-provoking presentations this afternoon. It's been a really fantastic selection of topics that we've covered and some great questions that have come in. And thank you to everyone who has joined us. And there are lots of comments coming in on the chat saying thank you to everybody and great papers from everyone. So yes, again, I'll reiterate that. Robin, I'm going to hand over to you. I'll share our slide that has our contact details. She says hopefully it'll come up. And would you like to talk, Robin, about what's coming up at the next At Home?
Yeah, I don't think our details are
Oh,
there. That's
no,
okay, don't worry, we'll put it in the chat. I'll
put it in the chat. No,
yeah.
Stop. Yeah.
No, that's okay. Yeah, just to say, please, I'm ahead of the game for a change, and I've got the registration ready for the next At Home, which I just wanted, as Lynn hinted at the beginning, because it's on the 30th of October, and because of some of the wonderful papers that were submitted, we decided that we can have a bit of a haunted Halloween-y kind of At Home. So you're welcome to come dressed up in whatever attire you wish, obviously. So our papers for the next At Home will be Hilary Davidson, our own Hilary Davidson, is going to talk about dressing the dead, archaeological burial clothing from 1800 to 1850. Chris Woodyard is going to talk about grief and grievance, mourning crepe as a symbol of protest. And Tatiana Contu, I hope I said that right, is talking about how to mourn and avoid melancholia through Victorian fashion. And then we're going to have a museum 5 minutes from Joe Lance from the Worthing Museum, highlighting some of the wonderful fancy dress in their collection, including things with beetle wings. And we all love a bit of beetle wing around here. Yeah. So it will be a good, and this session is going to be a little bit later. It's going to be at 4:30 GMT instead of at 2, both to accommodate a spookier time of day, and also because I'm going to be in Italy and I'm the host, and so my team has been very kind and saying, could I have it a bit later in the day, please? So that's really nice, but we'll all be on hand, and we hope that you all come, because it is going to be another great set of talks. But some big shoes to follow from this week, but I'm sure they're up to the challenge. So I will put the link in the chat right now so you can rush and register if you so choose, but there's plenty of space, so don't worry.
Oh, that's great. So it's already up on the Eventbrite page. Okay, so lots of bookings for the next session. That'll be wonderful. So it just leaves me to say another huge thank you to all our speakers, and thank you to Anna for fielding all the questions so ably, and for Robin to overseeing this session from the sort of technical point of view. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to our speakers. I hope, Sheilagh, that the weather starts to improve in Canada, and that you soon get your Wi-Fi connection back and we'll be able to join the rest of the world again. I know how frustrating that must be. Anyway, thank you to everyone. I wish you a good afternoon for the rest of what's left today. Thank you. We look forward to seeing you on the 30th of October.